Hello everyone, welcome to the CW DCTV Weekly Review. This week's review is going to be a little shorter because there were no new episodes for The Flash or Legends of Tomorrow, so all we have to discuss this week is Supergirl and Arrow. And before I get into the review, I just want to say there will be spoilers throughout. The first episode I will be discussing this week is Supergirl Season 2, Episode 12, titled Luthors. This week's episode, we are back to dealing with the Luthors and Cadmus, and the overarching story throughout the season is back in play. And I, for one, am glad that it is because I thought this was a great episode of Supergirl. We got to see a little bit more of what the Luthors look like in this world. Specifically, we get our first glimpse of a young Lex Luthor, or a child Lex Luthor, and he seems extremely sweet and innocent, a lot different than what his adult version is. Whether we ever get to see his adult version, I think remains to be seen. If we get more of Superman in the show, perhaps we'll see him, or perhaps if Superman gets his own show, we may see Lex Luthor in that. But this week we got to see a young Lena Luthor getting introduced to her family for the first time, being kind of ingratiated into the family through Lex, kind of harsh and cold treatment by her adopted mother, Lillian, who we already know is kind of a cold woman anyway. We also got to see Metallo back in the episode, John Corbin, who we were introduced way early on in the season, and he of course breaks out of prison through the machinations of Lillian. What he has is this malfunctioning type of kryptonite which is unstable. It is synthetic kryptonite, I assume, and there's kind of a race against time in the episode to when it will blow up. That was a really interesting aspect of the episode because seemingly Supergirl knows how to combat kryptonite a lot better now than she did before. The best part I found about the episode is we get to see more of the relationship between Kara and Lena Luthor. And what they are doing with this relationship is kind of developing it the way we have seen Clark and Lex's relationship in past iterations of those characters, whether it was on Smallville or in the comics. One of their origin stories is that they started out as friends, really close friends, kind of surrogate brothers, and when they grew up and became bitter enemies, it felt that much more poetic, or that much more Shakespearean, however you want to put it. And I think they're kind of going the same route when it comes to Kara and Lena. But what I want to see is more of that. I want to see them become really close friends, almost sister-type figures, which we got to see a little more in this episode. Kara defended Lena Luthor as if she was her sister. That was really interesting. And ultimately, at the end of the episode, we saw that Lena is not as innocent as Kara thinks that she is. That is definitely going to play out later on down the line. One of the more weaker part of last episode that I mentioned was the ending when it came to the relationship between Mon-El and Kara, but they pulled a complete 180 in this episode, and we find out that no, Mon-El is not really interested in this other woman. He is really heavily into Kara, and why oh why did they write that into the last episode if they were just going to pull the 180 anyway? There is an inevitability when it comes to Mon-El and Kara coming together. I think we all know this. A lot of us predicted this early on in the season, so why are you pulling these kind of tricks? But anywho, that's just kind of a small little thing I have. But what happened at the very end of this episode is that Mr. McSplitlick showed up and kind of ruined things a bit for Mon-El and Kara. Overall, I really like this episode. I can't wait to check out next week's. So moving on to more of a head-scratching episode for me, and that is Arrow Season 5, Episode 13, Spectre of the Gun. Now, this is an episode that is rather interesting because it is very much a filler episode. At least that's the way I viewed it. Which bothers me in that sense because we had a series of Arrow episodes that were very, very good, and I want to see the show continuing that momentum. Now, it was no secret during this episode that this episode was heavily political, and it is not the first time and it's not the last time that comic books or comic book adaptations are going to be political. It has happened for decades. Also, it felt extremely heavy-handed during the episode. I understand how important this subject is, but to be this heavy-handed with it is really going to turn people off. And I found myself, who was actually not an advocate for it, kind of turned off because of how heavy-handed it was. And it didn't do anything to drive the overall plot along. We haven't seen Prometheus in a few episodes. We've been really concentrating on Team Arrow, and I have to say, this episode definitely did that. Instead of seeing flashbacks of Oliver and Talia al Ghul in Russia, we got to see flashbacks of Wild Dog, so we get to see a bit of his origin. The problem I had with it is that I'm not really too interested in his origin right now. I probably would have been a little bit earlier. He's already been introduced into the team for so long. Why are we picking now to go back and do his origin? We also got to see a lot of kind of infighting within the group when it came to the different political ideals when it comes to gun control and things of that nature. But yet again, a lot of that came off heavy-handed. So, without overstating this anymore, it was a rather disappointing episode just from an Arrow story perspective, not specifically for its political message. So with all that being said, this has been the CW DCTV weekly review. If you like this video, please check out the other videos on my channel.